Have you ever seen your cat suddenly freeze, eyes locked on something that isn't there? Maybe you laughed. Maybe you brushed it off. A shadow. A draft. Just one of those cat things. But deep down, didn't a part of you wonder, what are they seeing that we can't? What are they feeling that we've forgotten how to feel? For thousands of years, cats have been worshipped, feared, and misunderstood. The Egyptians said they protected the soul from spirits that walk at night. Shamans believed they were guardians between worlds. And now in our living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, they still pause, still listen, still look into spaces we no longer recognize. What if your cat isn't reacting to the physical world, but perceiving another one? What if it's not superstition but signal? This isn't a story about pet behavior. It's about prophecy. A prophecy that was almost lost. One that Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, warned us about over 80 years ago. And it begins not with a human, but with a cat. This is the story of a cat, a prophet, and a warning humanity almost ignored. It was October of 1944, and while the world burned overseas, a different kind of mystery was unfolding in a quiet Virginia town. Eleanor Langston, a widowed school teacher from Arlington, had just stepped off a weary bus ride, clutching a leather satchel and a single black and white photograph. She hadn't traveled 3 states for a doctor or a priest. She had come seeking answers about her cat. Minerva, a sleek black feline Eleanor had raised from a kitten, had begun to behave in ways she couldn't explain. Not oddities, not quirks, patterns. Minerva stopped sleeping in the bedroom she once loved, choosing instead to perch outside the doorway and stare unmoving for hours. She hissed at mirrors that had hung on the wall for years. Every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., she cried out with a tone Eleanor described as almost human. It wasn't meowing, it was mourning. And Eleanor, a grounded woman who believed in ration stamps, not rituals, began to feel something she hadn't felt in decades: dread. Eleanor had heard of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He wasn't a magician or a showman. He didn't wear robes or predict lottery numbers. He was, by all appearances, ordinary. A Sunday school teacher, a father, a man who, when asleep, spoke as if guided by something far older than books or doctrine. She didn't know what to expect. She only knew her cat wasn't sick, but something was deeply, invisibly wrong. Inside a modest home in Virginia Beach, Eleanor placed Minerva's photo gently onto the desk. Cayce nodded silently and lay back on his worn couch. As he exhaled and slipped into trance, his voice deepened, not louder, but weightier, as if it carried not just sound, but memory. The room fell into a hush, and then he spoke. "She is not disturbed," Cayce said, eyes closed. "She is perceiving what you have been taught to ignore." Eleanor said nothing. She was gripping her skirt with both hands. Cayce continued, "Your companion walks in 2 worlds. She sees where you see only matter. She hears what you no longer remember how to listen for. The room she avoids is not empty. The mirrors are not clean." The air grew heavier. Cayce's tone shifted, not darker, but more urgent. "She is one of many. A wave is coming. Souls returning. Not in flesh you'd expect, but in fur, in feathers, in forms familiar yet misunderstood. They are not here to serve man, but to awaken him. These companions do not arrive by accident. They come to those ready to remember, too. Eleanor's heart pounded. She had not told him about the dreams, the ones that began the same week Minerva changed. In them, she walked through doorways that pulsed with light, always followed by a black cat who stared back at her as if it were remembering her name before she could speak it. She had dismissed them as grief. But now, those dreams felt less like symbols and more like messages. Cayce spoke again. Animals, particularly those you call felines, are attuned to the veil. They anchor the soul when it drifts. They warn not just of danger, but of energetic dissonance. Where there is a fracture in the field, they will cry. Where there is memory bleeding into the present, they will stare. Then, almost as if the words were not his but being passed through him, Cayce whispered, "They do not forget the song, even when you do." What followed was silence, not emptiness, but presence. As Cayce's breathing returned to normal and his trance ended, Eleanor sat motionless, tears not of fear, but recognition forming in her eyes. This wasn't about her cat acting strangely. This was about her soul finally remembering why the silence in her house had begun to feel loud. Minerva wasn't broken. She was speaking, and someone had finally translated. That reading was never published in Cayce's public medical archives, but in handwritten notes, underlined twice in blue ink by his secretary, one sentence stands out. A wave of animals is arriving not merely to comfort, but to awaken. That was nearly 80 years ago. And only now, as the veil thins once more, are we beginning to understand what he meant. Most people who read Edgar Cayce's work know him for healing, dreams, or Atlantis, but buried deep within his trance readings is a quiet, powerful thread. One that points not to ancient civilizations or distant planets, but to something much closer, the animals that share our homes. Cayce never described animals as primitive or lesser. In fact, he said the opposite. In one session, when asked about a family dog, he said, "The soul force moves through all that breathes." But when it came to cats, he went further. Cayce described them as uniquely attuned beings, conscious of both material and non-material realms, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. He spoke of animals as travelers on parallel paths of consciousness, souls, incarnating not to evolve toward humans, but alongside us. According to Cayce, cats were never meant to be domesticated ornaments. They were guardians, sentinels, interdimensional observers whose very presence altered the energetic climate of a space. In his words, they stand in doorways, not of buildings, but of dimensions. This language wasn't poetic, it was prophetic. Modern spirituality sometimes refers to cats as beings who can see spirits. Cayce took that idea much deeper. He claimed that cats sense what he called vibratory echoes, ripples left behind by emotional trauma, spiritual tension, or what he referred to as residue of soul experience. In practical terms, this means that when your cat avoids a certain chair, stares at a dark hallway, or follows invisible movements across the ceiling, it may not be reacting to nothing. It may be responding to something you've forgotten how to perceive. But this idea didn't begin with Cayce. Long before his readings, civilizations around the world revered cats not as pets, but as spiritual cohabitants. The Egyptians worshipped Bastet, the feline goddess of protection, intuition, and soul guidance. Priests would not begin certain rites until a cat entered the temple. Mummified cats were buried with pharaohs not as sacrifices, but as companions for the soul's journey through the afterlife. In ancient China, cats were believed to guard homes from evil spirits. In Japan, the Maneki Neko cat statue symbolized luck and divine blessing, but always with one paw lifted, as if sensing something beyond the veil. Cayce confirmed what the ancients intuited. He said that certain animals, especially cats, still remember the original language of energy, while humans developed logic, structure, and abstraction. Animals continued to evolve through presence, sensitivity, and emotional attunement. The result, a kind of awareness that doesn't need words because it feels everything. He was once asked whether animals have souls. Cayce didn't hesitate. The soul force, he said, is not exclusive to man. It is the breath behind all life. But with cats, there was something extra, something Cayce hinted at, but never fully explained. He spoke of them as keepers of threshold spaces and described their ability to anchor energy in moments of dissonance. This means when you're grieving and your cat won't leave your side, it's not just affection, it's soul-level co-regulation. When your cat curls up on your chest during a panic attack, it's not instinct, it's alignment. Cats do not need belief systems. They do not recite mantras. They are the mantra. Cayce said that one day, humanity would recognize animals not just as sentient, but as essential to the spiritual evolution of the planet. He foresaw a time when the energetic chaos of human civilization would escalate and animals, especially cats, would begin to respond not with violence or confusion, but with signals, patterns, presence. And maybe they already are. The next time your cat stares at a blank wall, don't rush to dismiss it. The next time it refuses to cross a threshold, pay attention. You might not see what they see, but that doesn't mean nothing is there. Cayce warned that humanity had dulled its perception, but he also gave us hope that animals had not. That they remembered. That they were holding open the frequencies we lost. So when your cat looks at you in silence, don't ask what's wrong instead. Ask, what do you know? Because the prophecy wasn't just that animals are aware, it was that they are waiting for us to be aware again. For decades, Edgar Cayce's prophecy about animals was dismissed as poetic metaphor, a beautiful idea, but unprovable. Even those drawn to his visions often skipped over the part where he said cats, dogs, and even birds would become our early warning systems, detecting changes not in the weather, but in consciousness itself. But then, the data started showing up. It didn't begin in a lab or lecture hall. It began, as most revelations do, with something unexplainable. In 2021, a video surfaced from Japan. It showed a domestic cat pacing frantically, meowing, and hiding under furniture. At first, it seemed like normal feline anxiety. But then came the timestamp. The footage was recorded 24 hours before a magnitude 6.8 earthquake struck the region. There had been no foreshocks, no electromagnetic anomalies detected by seismographs, no warning from human systems. Only the cat knew. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Akiko Tanaka, had been documenting her cat's odd behavior for months. And when the footage was reviewed alongside regional seismic logs, the pattern became undeniable. Her cat wasn't reacting to tremors. It was anticipating them. And that was just the beginning. In a Boston hospital, nurses began noticing something strange. A particular wing where terminal patients were treated often saw the same group of cats gathering outside specific rooms hours before the patient's vital signs deteriorated. The cats, silent and still, would wait outside the door until death occurred. Some tried to write it off as coincidence, but when hospital records were cross-referenced with feline behavior logs over a 2-year period, the predictive accuracy was staggering. It wasn't scent, it wasn't habit, it was timing. The cat simply knew not after the moment, but before it. Then came the studies. At the University of Helsinki, researchers placed domestic cats in an observation environment and exposed them to subtle emotional stimuli from human participants: silent grief, suppressed anxiety, repressed anger. Without any verbal cues, the cats responded not just behaviorally, but physiologically. Their pupils dilated, their whiskers stiffened, their heart rates shifted in measurable ways. They mirrored the emotional frequency of the human present, and even began anticipating changes in emotional state before the participants consciously expressed them. In simple terms, the cats didn't just respond to emotion, they sensed it forming. Which brings us to something more difficult to explain and harder to deny. Quantum biologist Dr. Sarah Chen, whose research originally focused on neural coherence in dolphins, began investigating the microsensory capacity of feline whiskers. What she found startled even her. Cat whiskers, long known for detecting wind, balance, and subtle vibrations, also seem to respond to micro-fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, shifts in space that often preceded changes in weather, seismic activity, and yes, human neurological states. She published her early findings cautiously, expecting pushback. But then her team conducted a blind trial in which cats were placed in EM-neutral environments that were later exposed to random field disturbances generated by a quantum oscillator. Time and again, the cats reacted before the disturbance registered on the equipment. Dr. Chen later said in a panel discussion, "We don't understand how the cat knows, only that it knows before we do, and perhaps that's the point." At first, mainstream media ignored it. It was too fringe, too strange, too threatening to the neat boxes science prefers. But the stories kept coming. In rural India, cats fled rooftops hours before a sudden monsoon no satellite had predicted. In Canada, a vet clinic recorded a cluster of cats refusing to eat 2 days before a power outage, fried the refrigeration systems, and saved every patient. In Chile, a stray cat was seen howling beneath a highway overpass, which collapsed 14 hours later with no seismic warning. 1 or 2 examples might be luck, a dozen might be curiosity, but hundreds documented, repeating, correlated across environments, species, and continents. It started to sound less like coincidence and more like confirmation. And here's where Cayce's voice echoes loudest. Because this wasn't just about earthquakes or illness. He said the animals would respond to energetic imbalance not just in the earth, but in the human soul. He described the emergence of animals born with heightened sensitivity to the fields that govern life's rhythm. Today we might call those fields quantum potentials, EM resonance, or subtle energetic vibration. But Cayce called it something older, the soul force. And now, the very science that once dismissed him is circling back and finding the edges of a truth too big to ignore. The question is no longer whether cats know something we don't. It's whether we're finally ready to believe them. It started as something small, A single photograph posted to a quiet corner of the internet. A domestic cat, a living room rug, and a peculiar arrangement of toys, symmetrical, precise, and unnerving. At first glance, it looked like play. But the more people looked, the more they realized this wasn't random. It was a pattern, a message. And it all began with a woman named Claire Thompson. In late 2023, Claire was living in British Columbia with her tabby cat, Esme. Esme had always been curious. She liked windowsills, cardboard boxes, and chasing beams of light across the kitchen floor. But that December, something changed. Esme began gathering household items, pens, small toys, socks, and arranging them each morning into circular shapes, always centered around a red rubber ring. The arrangements weren't chaotic. They were geometric, spirals, triangles, even a star-like formation laid out with eerie balance. Claire, a graphic designer by profession, couldn't help but notice the mathematical elegance. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate. At first, she thought it was a quirky habit, maybe the result of boredom or some subconscious training. But Esme kept doing it, every morning, and the shapes became more complex. One day, Claire found 7 items laid in a perfect Fibonacci spiral with the red ring at its heart. That night, she posted a photo online with the caption, "My cat keeps doing this. Should I be worried or impressed?" The post exploded. Within 24 hours, people from around the world were commenting, sharing their own stories of cats arranging objects, avoiding certain rooms, even seemingly tracking unseen forces. But it was what happened next that turned the story from viral to prophetic. Exactly 48 hours after Esme created the Fibonacci spiral, a localized blackout struck Claire's neighborhood. No warning, no storm, no electrical surge. A transformer failed due to a sudden voltage spike traced to a magnetic anomaly, something rare, invisible, and unpredictable. But when Claire overlaid Esme's arrangement on a map of her area, the spiral aligned with the substation's coordinates perfectly. It wasn't just eerie, it was precise. Scientists reached out. Journalists ran stories. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence, pattern projection, pareidolia. But others weren't so sure. Dr. Marcus Ellison, a neurosemiotics researcher at Cambridge, reviewed the photos and noted that Esme's arrangements bore striking resemblance to ancient mandalas and crop circles, symbolic structures often associated with energy fields and vibrational language. "This is not random behavior," he said. "This is nonverbal intelligence manifesting in spatial syntax. In simple terms, this cat may be using geometry as language." And the deeper people looked, the stranger it became. Esme's patterns echoed sacred symbols found in Tibetan sand mandalas, spirals used in Celtic spiritual maps, and even geometries discovered in solar flare tracking data. The number 7 appeared repeatedly in the number of items used, in days between formations, in the distance from Esme's home to electromagnetic epicenters. Claire began documenting each formation, logging the shapes, the emotional energy in the home, the changes in light and temperature. She wasn't trying to make it mystical. She was trying to make it make sense. But perhaps that was never the point. Because Cayce had said it plainly: when the animals begin to communicate in ways that cannot be denied, humanity will face its greatest choice. And now, here was a cat creating what looked suspiciously like a visual language, rooted not in survival, but in meaning. A kind of sacred geometry born through fur, paw, and intention. It wasn't just behavior, it was intention, language without words. Esme's story triggered thousands of similar accounts. People posted videos of cats arranging shoes in directional clusters, dragging toys to doorways that aligned with fault lines, even choosing sleeping spots based on lunar phases. Not just reactions, but rituals. Not just instincts, but symbols. And maybe that's what we missed all along. We trained animals to understand our words: sit, stay, no. But we never stopped to learn the language they were already using: arrangement, movement, stillness, repetition. A silent form of symbology that Cayce warned we would one day have to reckon with. Because what if the prophecy wasn't about animals becoming more conscious? What if they already were? And what if the spirals, the cries, the stares into nothing were all invitations? To remember the language before words. To remember the intelligence before intellect. To remember the field of connection we once knew, and they never forgot. For centuries, we've been taught that consciousness lives inside the skull, a byproduct of neurons firing, synapses sparking, chemicals colliding in just the right sequence. It's what we've been told separates us from the animal kingdom, that our awareness, our soul, our sense of I, is born from the complexity of the human brain. But what if that model is incomplete? What if the brain doesn't create consciousness, but filters it? What if, as Edgar Cayce once implied, the mind is not the source of awareness, but the receiver? In his trance readings, Cayce often referred to something he called the soul force, a living current of energy that flowed not through individuals, but through all of life. He described it not as something confined to organs or bone, but as a field, a radiant intelligence that permeated all things, binding the visible and invisible together. It was, in his words, the vibratory essence behind all being. Decades before neuroscience dared to question the brain as generator model, Cayce had already said what quantum physicists are only now beginning to whisper, that consciousness may not be local, that it may not even be ours. It may be something we move through, like a river, something we access, like a frequency, something animals never stop tuning into. This may explain what we call instinct, not an evolutionary leftover, not a guess refined over time, but direct reception awareness without cognition, a knowing that comes before thought, a whisper from the field. Cats, Cayce said, are particularly attuned to this. Their nervous systems, their sensory organs, their silence, all are designed not for domination or control, but for alignment. They don't overthink. They don't rationalize. They feel. They feel places, people, shifts. They enter a room and assess not the layout, but the energy. And they remember, not with stories or symbols, but with orientation, presence, stillness. Dr. Sarah Chen, whose quantum work with animal perception has become a cornerstone in this emerging field, made a statement that now feels more prophetic than scientific animals do not imagine futures. They move through probability. She meant that while humans obsess over possibilities, animals respond to potentiality, to the energetic landscape before it crystallizes into matter. In simple terms, animals don't wait for something to happen. They move when it's about to. This aligns perfectly with Cayce's vision. He said that animals, unlike humans, never lost their resonance with the Earth's consciousness field. While we built structures to protect us from nature, they stayed tuned to it. While we flooded our senses with noise, they listened deeper. And now, as the planet itself begins to shift magnetically, energetically, spiritually, it is the animals who are noticing first. Not because they're more advanced, but because they're less distracted. Consider this: if consciousness is a field like gravity, like magnetism, then everything alive is immersed in it. But not everything filters it the same way. The human mind, brilliant as it is, also narrows perception. It slices and defines and rejects what doesn't fit. It's a survival mechanism, yes, but it comes at a cost. We've tuned out the frequency that animals still swim in. When Cayce said, "They walk between worlds," he wasn't speaking symbolically. He meant that some animals, cats in particular, are simultaneously aware of the energetic and the physical. They sense what we overlook. They react to what we deny. They guide us toward what we've forgotten. So when your cat stares at a wall, curls into a circle, and purrs like it's harmonizing with something you can't hear, maybe it's not strange. Maybe it's alignment. Maybe it's resonance with a field we used to feel, before language replaced wonder. Maybe cats aren't just perceptive. Maybe they are preservers of something ancient, a frequency that once guided us too. What we call instinct may be the universe whispering. And what we call silence may be a language we've lost the ability to translate. It happened quietly. No breaking news, no sirens, no storms. Just a moment, a stillness, a breath the world didn't know it was holding. It was New Year's Eve, 2024. In cities across the globe, millions gathered to celebrate, to shout, to count, to drink, to kiss the usual rituals of turning time. But as the final seconds ticked toward midnight, something strange began to unfold. And it didn't begin with humans. It began with cats. From Tokyo to Toronto, from Cape Town to Cairo, people would later describe the same eerie occurrence. At exactly 11:59 p.m., local time regardless of time zone, their cats changed. Some stood up abruptly from deep sleep. Others froze mid-step. A few bolted to dark corners, only to stare with unblinking eyes at nothing at all. Many went utterly still, ears back, tails stiff, as if bracing for something unseen. Not fear, not panic, awareness. Across social media, hundreds of posts began appearing almost simultaneously. My cat just locked eyes with something invisible. She's staring at the ceiling. Hasn't blinked in a full minute. It's like he hears something I can't. Some users described their cats making low vocalizations, guttural tones not typical of normal meowing. Others said their cats simply stopped moving altogether, transfixed, not asleep, not alert, just present. And then, a few minutes later, it passed. No bang, no flash, just the slow return of ordinary motion. Cats blinked, turned away, licked a paw, went back to their usual perch. But something in the air felt different, lighter, or heavier. Nobody could agree, only that something had been there and then gone. In homes where there were no cats, humans still reported unusual sensations. A tingling at the base of the skull, a deep emotional pull, sudden tears without memory. In hospitals, the heart monitors of patients stabilized for exactly 60 seconds. In forests, trail cams captured nocturnal animals pausing a deer mid-step. An owl turning its head sharply as if it had heard a voice from somewhere far beyond the trees. On ships and in mountain towns, People described a strange pressure in the chest, like the air had thickened with presence. Not fear, not dread, but a kind of reverence. As the reports accumulated, one word kept repeating itself: watched. Not in a paranoid sense, but in the way a child feels seen by something holy. People weren't scared. They were still, humbled, like a veil had lifted just long enough for them to realize we are not alone, and maybe we never were. In retrospect, many dismissed it. Group hysteria, mass suggestion, the emotional weight of a new year, but the timestamps don't lie, nor do the thermal scans, the animal monitoring data, the wave of simultaneous cat behavior logged across 6 continents. Something moved through the field, not a sound, not a shape, but a presence. And as Edgar Cayce once wrote in a trance so deep, his own voice barely held its edges. When the world grows too loud to hear its own soul, the animals will become its tuning fork. That night, it was the cats who heard it first. The silent moment became a kind of mystical artifact spoken of in comment sections, dream journals, podcast episodes, and late-night phone calls between friends trying to make sense of what they felt. They couldn't explain it, but they couldn't forget it either. Because it wasn't just silence, it was communion. A reminder not of danger, but of design. A signal that something is remembering us as we remember ourselves. A soft ripple in the field of consciousness that whispered, "You are being called home." And the cats, as always, were waiting at the threshold. Maybe you felt it, that quiet moment when your cat places a paw on your chest during a restless night, not out of habit, but as if anchoring you to something deeper. That moment when they look at you, not with curiosity, not with need, but with a presence that feels older than the room you're in. It's easy to dismiss it, easy to laugh it off, to say cats are mysterious, and leave it at that. But what if they aren't just mysterious? What if they are remembering something we forgot? Edgar Cayce never called cats magical. He didn't need to. He saw them as what they are: bridges between matter and spirit, between past and presence, between the soul and the subtle currents of the universe. He believed animals were not placed here for our amusement or our utility, but for our remembering. They are not behind us in evolution. They walk beside us, tuned to a field we stopped listening to, grounded in a wisdom we traded for language and logic. Cats, Cayce said, are particularly gifted in this role, not because they love us more, but because they never stopped seeing what was always there. While we've built cities of concrete and algorithms, they've remained rooted in something quieter. They watch the light move. They listen to the air before it shifts. They know when we are not okay, not because we tell them, but because we don't have to. They live not in our timelines or our distractions, but in our frequency, in the in-between. And perhaps most importantly, they wait. They wait for us to notice. They wait for us to remember how to sit in silence without reaching for a screen. How to feel the ache in a room without needing to fix it. How to be present, truly present, without performing it. Because in their stillness is a message that presence itself is healing. That awareness itself is the bridge. That we were never meant to navigate this life alone, not emotionally, not energetically, not spiritually. Cayce once wrote in a reading so quiet it was nearly lost in the archives. When the cats begin to speak in silence, humanity will remember. And maybe that time is now. Maybe they've been speaking all along in gestures, in patterns, in energy we once knew how to read. And maybe what we've been calling coincidence is actually invitation. A chance to step out of forgetting and into relationship. Not ownership, not command, but communion. Because they were never just comforting us when we were sad. They were guiding us back to ourselves. So if your cat has ever stared into the dark hallway long after you left the light, if they've meowed when no one knocked, curled beside you before you even knew you needed to cry, or sat beside the window moments before a thunderstorm, maybe it wasn't instinct. Maybe it was remembrance. Maybe it was prophecy, wrapped in fur and silence and golden eyes. And maybe the real question isn't, how do they know? Maybe it's, when did we stop believing them? They were never just pets. They were prophets, waiting for us to listen. If your cat has ever done something you couldn't explain, a moment of knowing, of warning, of connection, we want to hear it. Share your story below, because your truth might be the message someone else needs to remember their own. The animals never stopped speaking. They only waited for us to hear again.